The dog hadn't moved in 3 hours, just sat there, trembling, staring at an empty barn like something inside was about to crawl out of hell. Thaddeus Bell hadn't spoken to another living soul in 16 days, not since the supply run to Dry Hollow, where the grocer said nothing more than cash or trade, and the wind did most of the talking. He didn't mind the silence. It suited him like the calluses on his hands or the dust on his boots. Out here, on land that cracked beneath the sun and howled when it stormed, silence wasn't empty. It was earned. His ranch sat low in a sunburnt valley, framed by a leaning windmill, a barn with no animals, and a house too big for one man. Since Martha passed, the place had folded in on itself. No more garden rows, no more rocking chair creaks, just dry fences, peeling paint, and memories that clung like smoke in the rafters. Most days, Thaddeus kept busy the only way a grieving man could, splitting wood, checking the well, walking the line fence like it mattered. Nights were harder, nights pressed against the windows, nights asked questions, and sometimes, when the wind came down off the ridge just right, he thought he could hear her humming that old tune she'd sing while hanging laundry, soft and low. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he missed her so bad it hurt behind his ribs. And lately, he wasn't the only one who felt something wasn't right. His dog had started watching the barn like the dead still lived there. Pastor wasn't just a dog. He was a chapter in Thaddeus's life, a chapter written in blood, dust, and loyalty too deep to explain. For 12 years, the mutt had followed Thaddeus through every winter storm, every fence repair, every thunder-cracked night when coyotes cried from the hills. Half shepherd, half something wilder, Pastor was bone-lean, scarred, and yellow-eyed like he'd stared into the sun too long and it had blinked first. But now, the dog was different. It started subtle. He stopped finishing his food, sniffed at his water bowl like it held secrets. Then he stopped lying near the porch, started pacing instead, tight, repetitive circles every evening, pausing only to stare toward the barn like it whispered to him. Sometimes he whimpered low, throat tight, tail stiff, eyes locked on something Thaddeus couldn't see. That dog, who'd once chased a cougar clean off the property, was now afraid of a building full of dust and silence. Then came the stillness. That morning, Pastor hadn't moved for hours, just sat there in the dirt, trembling, not sick, not weak, but as if the earth beneath him hummed with a warning only he could hear. The land around the ranch had the kind of silence that scraped at your thoughts. No birdsong, no distant cattle lowing. Just the endless moan of wind through brittle grass and the whisper of time undoing everything man once built. The West didn't care if you lived or died, it only cared that you left quietly. The barn stood at the edge of the property like a forgotten sentinel, its red paint long since peeled to gray, its hinges rusted stiff. Dust filtered through the cracks like smoke from old sins. The stalls were empty, had been since Martha passed. No more horses, no more milk cow, just a hanging bridle, a shovel leaning in the corner, and tools on the wall still outlined in shadow where sun hadn't touched in years. When Thaddeus passed that barn now, he did it quick, like crossing a grave. Too many memories lived inside. The scent of hay, Martha's laughter when a calf licked her dress, the hollow echo of what used to be. And lately, the air around it had changed. Thicker, still, as if the barn itself was holding its breath. Pastor wouldn't look away. He'd taken to sitting at the same spot every morning, where the yard gave way to the dry slope leading to the barn, and just stared, motionless, like a statue carved from sinew and bone. His yellow eyes never blinked. His nose twitched now and then, as if catching a scent buried deep beneath the dirt. His ears stayed low, flat, alert. Not fear exactly, but tension like a wolf sensing a tremor before the quake. Thaddeus had watched him one morning from the window, coffee gone cold in his hand, wondering if old dogs saw things young men had learned to ignore. A snake, no. Not this time. A storm coming. No wind, no clouds, no explanation. There was something under the ground, something pulling at Pastor, night after night, like a magnet made of bones and memory. Something not visible, not audible, but real enough to make the hair rise along the dog's spine. And in all his years on that land, Thaddeus had never seen Pastor this way. Not once. It was mid-morning when Thaddeus finally stepped off the porch and followed the line of his dog's stare, boots crunching dry earth beneath him. The barn loomed ahead, sun-scorched and silent, casting long shadows across the patchy ground. Pastor didn't move, didn't even flinch, just tracked him with his eyes, as if urging but unwilling to come closer. Thaddeus slowed as he neared the barn's east wall. That's when he saw it. The ground was wrong. The soil near the foundation, normally baked hard and packed from years of wind, was loose, darker, unsettled. It crumbled underfoot like a grave too fresh. There were claw marks in the dust, shallow furrows. Something had dug here recently, or tried to escape. He knelt down, brushing his calloused fingers across the disturbed earth. The smell was faint, damp, sour, old. Pastor finally stood and took a few cautious steps forward, his breathing quick, ears flat, tail low. A weight settled on Thaddeus's chest, heavy, familiar. The feeling you get just before a storm hits, or a truth rises. His shovel struck something soft. It wasn't rock, it wasn't root. It gave slightly under pressure, like fabric stretched over flesh. Thaddeus dropped to his knees, his breath shallow, and clawed at the dirt with both hands. The earth peeled back reluctantly, revealing canvas rough, weather-stained, and reeking of something sweet and foul. Pastor whined behind him, a sharp, broken sound that made Thaddeus's stomach turn. He tugged at a fold in the cloth, and the bundle shifted. Another tug revealed pale skin, a hand, curled and stiff, fingers frozen in a grasp that would never unclench. A gold wedding band still clung to one slender finger, glinting weakly in the morning light. The hand was delicate, manicured, not a drifter, not a stranger, a woman with a life, with a name. Thaddeus fell back, dirt clinging to his shirt, bile rising in his throat. His heart pounded so hard it drowned out the wind. Someone had buried her here, on his land, near his barn, and his dog had known it all along. The wind had just started to shift when Thaddeus saw the dust trail on the horizon. He squinted past the barn, heart still thudding from what he'd uncovered, and watched as a lone rider emerged from the southern ridge. The figure moved slow but certain, not like a stranger feeling his way through unfamiliar land, but like a man who knew exactly where he was going. And why? Pastor growled before Thaddeus even saw the face. Ezra Crow. He hadn't been by in months, not since he'd borrowed a fence stretcher and never returned it. A neighbor in title, 5 miles south, but more like a shadow that passed too close. Ezra always spoke with a smile, but his eyes never matched his mouth. Something slick beneath the surface, like oil on water or a lie told too often. Thaddeus stood tall, brushing the dirt from his palms, trying to steady his breathing as Ezra reined in beside the porch. The man's horse was well fed, tack clean, saddle polished, too polished for someone claiming hard times. "Morning, Thaddeus," Ezra said, voice warm but hollow. "Didn't expect to see you out so early." Doing some digging, Thaddeus didn't answer right away. Pastor stepped between them, hackles raised. Ezra dismounted slow, like he had all the time in the world. His boots hit the ground with a deliberate thud. He gave Pastor a sidelong glance, the kind of look a man gives a dog he's not quite sure he can turn his back on. "Looks like you've been busy," Ezra said, nodding toward the shovel still stuck in the earth a few yards from the barn. Thaddeus didn't move to cover it, didn't lie either. He simply stood there, sweat drying on his neck, every muscle wound tight. "Ground's been soft," he said evenly. "Thought I'd fix the drainage before it spreads toward the fence line." Ezra walked a slow half-circle, boots crunching over loose dirt. His gaze dropped to the patch of disturbed earth. He paused there just a little too long. "We haven't had rain in 3 weeks," he said quietly. Thaddeus didn't answer. Pastor shifted beside him, teeth bared in silence. Ezra knelt down near the dirt, not touching it, just studying it. "Funny thing," he murmured, almost to himself. "Sometimes the ground shifts even without water. Sometimes things rise up when they're supposed to stay down." Then he looked up, smiling. But it was the kind of smile men wore at funerals, not birthdays. Pastor moved without being told. He stepped between the two men, slow and silent, placing his body squarely between Ezra and Thaddeus like a drawn line in the dust. His stance was rigid, tail low, legs locked. Then, for the first time in 12 years, he growled at a man he knew. Not a low warning, not the uncertain rumble of a dog confused by scent. This was something else, a growl born of certainty, recognition, threat. Ezra raised an eyebrow but didn't back away. "Now that's curious," he said, tipping his hat back slightly. "Never known this mutt to show teeth to folks he's met before." Pastor's lips peeled farther, exposing yellowed teeth that had once torn through a coyote's throat. His ears twitched but never turned. His eyes stayed locked on Ezra like they'd finally remembered what they'd smelled all along. Thaddeus felt his own pulse rise. It wasn't just what the dog was doing. It was what the dog had never done before. And out here on land where justice traveled slower than rumor, a dog's instinct was sometimes the last truth a man had left. Thaddeus didn't blink. He reached down, slow and steady, and pulled the shovel from the soil with a practiced grip. The blade came up clean, thank God, and he leaned it casually over his shoulder like a man who had nothing to hide but time to kill. Every movement deliberate, every breath measured. The canvas bundle lay just behind him, covered again with dirt, but barely. He prayed Ezra hadn't seen the edge peeking out like a wound that wouldn't stay closed. "Wasn't expecting company," Thaddeus said, forcing a half shrug. "Drainage line keeps flooding near the porch when wind comes in from the south. Figured I'd open up a channel, see if it clears." Ezra looked around, at the sky, at the dry hills, at the cracked, thirsty earth where no recent rain could explain mud. "Storm must have missed me," he said, voice mild, but his eyes never left the ground behind Thaddeus. Thaddeus turned slightly, just enough to put his own body between Ezra and the grave. The lie was fragile, but sometimes lies had to hold up longer than the truth. Pastor stayed close, low growl rumbling in his throat like distant thunder, and Ezra just smiled again. But this time, his fingers drifted casually, but not innocently toward the gun at his hip. The wind shifted again this time with purpose. Pastor's ears shot up. His head turned toward the tree line beyond the pasture. A second later, Thaddeus heard it too, the distant thunder of hooves against hard-packed earth. Fast, heavy, more than one. Ezra's expression flickered just for a moment, like a card turned the wrong way in a poker hand. He turned his head toward the sound, squinting into the light. 3 riders crested the far ridge. Their horses were slick with sweat, flanks heaving from the run. Dust streamed behind them like smoke from something burning in the distance. The lead rider wore a red bandana low over his face and rode like he was born in the saddle. The 2 behind him hung back just enough to stay dangerous predators who'd learned the value of flanking instead of charging. Pastor growled again. But it wasn't for Ezra this time. It was for all of them. Ezra straightened up, jaw tight. "Well, now," he muttered. "Didn't expect them today." "Friends of yours?" Thaddeus asked, already knowing the answer. Ezra didn't look at him. He didn't need to. His hand rested lightly on his revolver, fingers twitching once. The lead rider pulled up short, eyes sweeping the scene, the barn, the dirt, the shovel, the distance between men. Then he smiled. "Afternoon, Crow," he called, voice like broken glass. "Didn't expect to find you playing in the dirt." The rider with the red bandana eased his horse forward. His eyes never left the disturbed earth behind Thaddeus. The faint curve of canvas barely hidden by a thin veil of soil. The smile on his face widened, not amused, but satisfied. The kind of smile a wolf wears when the trap closes. "Well, well," he drawled. "Looks like we're not the only ones interested in what's buried out here." Thaddeus didn't move, didn't speak. Pastor pressed against his leg, growling low and steady. Ezra shifted his weight uneasily. "Jesse," he said, voice taut. "What brings you this far north?" The rider pulled down his bandana. He was younger than Thaddeus expected. Wild eyes, sun-cracked lips, something feral in the way he grinned. "Trail brought us," Jesse said. "We've been tracking something, or someone, and that trail led us straight here." He glanced toward the grave, then back to Ezra. "Tell me, Crow, did you do it clean, or sloppy, like last time?" Ezra's hand tightened on his pistol. Jesse ignored the gesture. "We had a deal. Get the girl, get the necklace, and disappear her where no one would find her. But here you are, still standing on her grave like you're proud of it." Thaddeus felt the chill crawl up his spine. They weren't guessing. They knew. All of them. They knew who the woman was. They knew why she'd been killed. And now, standing on his land, they knew she'd been found. Pastor's growl deepened as Jesse's 2 riders dismounted, hands near their belts, eyes scanning the terrain. Ezra took a step back, suddenly outnumbered by men he'd once called partners. But Jesse wasn't looking at him anymore. He was looking at Thaddeus. "What about you, rancher?" he asked, voice too casual. "You know what you're standing over, or did Crow forget to tell you the dirt? Here's laced with silver and blood." The wind went still, and in that silence, Thaddeus realized something simple, brutal, and true. He wasn't just standing over a grave. He was standing in the middle of a war. Pastor moved before anyone else. No command, no warning, just a sudden, sharp bark that cut through the tension like a whip crack. And then he bolted, not at Jesse, not at Ezra, but at the grave. His claws tore into the loose soil with frantic purpose, dirt flying behind him in ragged bursts. Ezra shouted, Jesse cursed, and Thaddeus stood frozen as Pastor dug, not with fear, but with fury desperate and unrelenting, like he'd waited weeks for this moment. In seconds, the edge of the canvas was exposed again. Pastor lunged forward, gripped it in his teeth, and ripped it away with a violent yank. The wind caught the fabric like a ghost, dragging it clear, revealing what had been hidden in the dirt. A woman's face, young, delicate, slack in death but unmistakably known, even beneath the pallor and the blood-matted hair. Thaddeus recognized her. Delilah, Martha's little sister. The girl who used to ride bareback through their fields, who brought wildflowers into the kitchen, who once told Thaddeus he laughed like a tired horse. Gone. Murdered, buried like garbage on his land. The gold ring still clung to her finger. Her mouth was slightly open, as if trying to speak even now. But it wasn't her face that made Jessie's expression curdle into rage. It was what hung from her neck, a silver chain, and on it, a locket the size of a coin, stained but still shining through the blood. The thing they'd killed her for, the thing Ezra had failed to take. Thaddeus dropped to one knee, his breath caught between grief and disbelief. Delilah's skin had gone pale blue in death, but the silver locket around her neck glinted with quiet defiance, as if untouched by decay or guilt. With trembling fingers, he unclasped the chain and held the pendant up to the light. Blood smeared its edges, but the hinge still worked. It opened with a soft click. Inside, behind a glass window cracked down the center, was a faded photograph Thaddeus himself, standing beside Martha on their wedding day. Younger, smiling, whole. The image had no reason to be there, unless Delilah had placed it close to her heart. Opposite the photo, etched into the inner shell of the locket, was something far stranger, a series of lines, curves, and notations carved with surgical precision. Not decorative, not sentimental. A map, carved directly into the silver, rivers, ridges, and a mark shaped like a silver nugget notched into the lower corner. A treasure map. Jessie swore under his breath. Ezra went pale. The silence that followed wasn't reverent. It was the silence of vultures who just realized the meat wasn't buried yet. Jessie's fist clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. "You goddamn fool," he hissed at Ezra, stepping closer, voice low and shaking, not from fear, but from barely leashed rage. "We weren't supposed to leave the locket. Crow." That was the whole damn point. His boots crushed the loose dirt as he moved toward the grave, eyes locked on the necklace now trembling in Thaddeus's fingers. "You buried the key with her," Jessie spat. "Do you have any idea what we risked to find that mine?" Ezra tried to speak, but Jessie cut him off. We followed her halfway across the state. Delilah Rhodes, snooping in archives, sniffing around her daddy's old deeds, asking questions about the Red Hollow claim like she had some right to it. He gestured to the grave with disgust. "And now here she is, rotting in a rancher's yard, with the one thing we needed around her neck." His voice cracked then, and the fury in it wasn't just greed, it was betrayal. "You said you took it, Ezra. You said she didn't have it on her." Ezra looked cornered, sweat starting to bead at his temples. I thought I did," he stammered. "She fought back. Bit me. I must have dropped it." Jessie turned to Thaddeus slowly, like a man measuring distance with a gun already cocked. "That map leads to more silver than you've ever seen in your miserable life," he said, "and she died for it." Thaddeus knelt beside the body, his hands no longer trembling from shock, but from something colder, deeper, a fury tightening like wire around his ribs. The locket still rested in his palm, but now his other hand moved slowly, gently over the folds of Delilah's tattered dress. In the inside pocket of her coat, he found it a folded letter, stiff with dried blood, the edges worn. the paper softened by sweat and time. He opened it carefully. The ink was smudged, but still legible, each word more damning than the last. It wasn't a goodbye. It wasn't a love note. It was evidence. If I don't return to San Carlos by the 10th, give this to Sheriff Doyle. Ezra Crowe forged the Red Hollow deed. He filed it 2 days after Papa was shot. He lied about seeing the shooter, but I found Papa's old journal. He knew Ezra was after the land. He just didn't think a man he trusted like a brother would pull the trigger. Thaddeus's eyes froze on that last line. He remembered the day Martha got word that her father had died in a hunting accident. He remembered Ezra at the funeral, hands folded, face solemn, not a single tear. Now the truth lay stiff in his hand. Ezra hadn't just buried Delilah. He'd buried her father, too, and tried to bury the only thing left that could speak for them both. There was no warning bark this time, no growl, no snarl, just motion raw, explosive, lightning from fur and fang. Pastor lunged from behind Thaddeus like a cannon shot, his body a blur of muscle and purpose. He launched straight at Ezra's throat. The outlaw barely had time to raise his arm before the dog sank his teeth deep into flesh. Ezra screamed, staggered, and dropped the revolver he'd been subtly reaching for. Blood sprayed across the dirt. Jesse drew fast, but so did one of his men. Guns exploded in the still afternoon, loud and brutal like thunder in a canyon. The first bullet clipped the brim of Thaddeus's hat. The second missed wide. Thaddeus dove behind the wagon, heart pounding, ears ringing. The graveyard had become a battlefield. Pastor didn't let go, not even when Ezra crashed to the ground, thrashing, fists flailing. The dog held like a man possessed, snarling, ripping. Thaddeus grabbed the fallen pistol cold steel against sweat-slick hands and turned. Jesse shouted something, maybe a curse, maybe a warning. The air stank of gunpowder and blood. One rider fell, another screamed and rode off. It was chaos, fast and deadly, and in the middle of it all, the dog Pastor stood his ground, jaws red, refusing to back down. Smoke curled in the dry air as the last shot echoed off the canyon wall. Jesse and his men had scattered, one dead, one wounded, the third galloping into the horizon. Thaddeus emerged from cover, heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. The pistol trembled in his grip, but he kept it raised as he stepped toward the grave. Ezra was crawling bloodied, gasping, and broken, but still alive. Somehow, he had pried himself free from Pastor's jaws, one arm useless and dangling, the other reaching. Not for help, for the locket. His fingers clawed toward Delilah's still chest, toward the gleam of silver. "Don't," Thaddeus said, voice hoarse, but firm. Ezra froze, looked up, their eyes locked, one man pleading, the other unmoved. "She was your family," Thaddeus added, bitter disbelief thick in his throat. "And you put her in the ground," Ezra sneered, bloody teeth bared. "There's enough silver in that mine to buy a new family." Thaddeus didn't hesitate. One shot. Straight through the heart, Ezra collapsed backward, half in, half out of the grave he had dug for another. Pastor limped over and lay beside Delilah's body, as if to guard her soul one last time. Thaddeus holstered the pistol, looked down at the man who'd caused so much death, now buried in the hole he made. The necklace still untouched on Delilah's chest. Justice wasn't always blind out here. Sometimes it had a dog's eyes and a rancher's steady aim. The sun was sinking low, casting long amber streaks across the hills as Thaddeus stood alone in the meadow behind the barn. A light wind rustled the tall grass, whispering like the ghosts of the past. Two simple wooden crosses marked the graves, one for Martha, long at rest, the other, freshly dug for Delilah Rhodus, whose truth had cost her everything. Thaddeus placed the silver necklace gently in Delilah's folded hands, not as a prize, but as a symbol of what she died for, not treasure, but justice. He had read her letter one final time that morning. Then he burned it. Let the world forget the conspiracy, the mine, the bloodshed. Let her memory rest clean. The ashes scattered across the field, caught in the breeze like prayers. Pastor didn't watch the barn anymore. He lay curled between the two graves, tail flicking softly, his eyes no longer haunted. Whatever had drawn him to the dirt was gone, now answered, unearthed, and laid to peace. Thaddeus ran a hand over the weathered wood of Martha's cross, then Delilah's. He didn't say much. He'd never been one for speeches. Just a quiet promise. No one else gets buried here because of greed again. As twilight fell, he stood with Pastor at his side, gazing toward the open land. He didn't know where the mine was, and he didn't care. Some riches weren't meant to be found. Some were meant to stay buried with the secrets, the sins, and the bones. Let the land remember the blood, but carry no more bones. And with that, they turned from the grave, two shadows walking east, toward the rising moon, one man, one dog, and the long silence of peace finally earned. There are graves we dig with shovels, and there are others we dig with silence. The grave by the barn isn't just a story about betrayal or buried treasure. It's a story about what happens when we ignore the voices that refuse to be silenced, when loyalty is the last defense against injustice, and a dog sees what men cannot. Thaddeus Bell never asked for redemption. But in choosing truth over silver, in honoring the dead instead of burying the past, he found something worth more than a fortune piece. And maybe that's the lesson for us, too. Sometimes peace doesn't come when the noise stops. It comes when we finally face what we've buried. So tell me, what would you have done if you were Thaddeus? Would you have walked away with the necklace, or stayed to honor the dead? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Save this story for a quiet night. You'll want to come back to it. And if tales like this speak to you of justice, memory, and the American soul, hit that subscribe button. There's more where this came from. Out here, stories don't end with a bang. They echo across the plains. And this one's only just begun.